Rory Stewart, welcome. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Back from the campaign and back to the day job.
I'm back in my day job, and I've just come from 2 days ago hosting a state banquet for the President of Iraq. And then today I had a meeting with Gordon Brown, meeting with the Israeli ambassador. I saw the Prime Minister of St. Vincent, and I've been talking particularly about Ebola and climate.
It's your dream job, as you said. You'll miss it, won't you?
I miss it terribly. If Boris becomes Prime Minister, in 4 weeks' time I'll be out of the job. So one of the real challenges for me at the moment is making sure that I think realistically about what I can really achieve in 4 weeks. And I think those are a couple of things. One of them is to really make sure that DFID doubles its effort on climate and the environment, gets out of the idea that you can somehow do poverty and development without thinking about the environment. And the second thing is to get more British experts on the ground so that we're not just a department that spends money, but that we have the best health and education experts on the ground in Nigeria or Ethiopia or wherever we are.
You're trying to entrench a whole sort of change of direction in a department in about a month.
Absolutely.
You're quite a restless individual, aren't you?
Well, I like getting things done. I like changing things.
I use that word restless because having watched your comet go across the night sky and the leadership contest, one wonders, will you really hang around in this particular playground for a long time, or will there be another new adventure in the Rory Stewart story?
So this has been something that people have been saying for a very long time. One of my colleagues, when I came into politics 10 years ago, thought that I'd only stick around for a year or two. Actually, what I've picked up, particularly through the last few weeks, is a much more of a sense of drive and vocation in politics. I mean, I really have got a whole new energy because as a constituency MP, a lot of my life has been either in Westminster or in Cumbria. And the great advantage of running for leadership is you have the advantage to do two things. One of them is to get to Derry, Londonderry, or get to Tower Hamlets. And the second thing is to really begin to talk about things outside my ministerial field, which I haven't been able to do for 3 years, talk about adult social care, which I haven't been able to talk about tree planting, talk about restructuring government. And actually, that's what's fun about politics. What's fun about politics is both seeing the variety of the United Kingdom, not simply shuttling between the Lake District and Westminster, but secondly, being able to really think about how to make this country a better place in 15 years' time rather than being in your narrow departmental block.
But you could be looking at being a backbencher, perhaps, possibly, who knows the future at the moment, for a long time. You'd really sit that out, endure that?
I do it in a completely different way. So if I was a backbencher in 4 or 5 weeks' time, I would keep going with Rory Walks. So I would aim to be walking through every county in the United Kingdom. And what I've learnt through doing it is that I can stand somewhere in Poplar and have a conversation with one person who might be talking about mental health treatment, or it might be a nurse talking about training the NHS, but then 650,000 people can then watch that. Or in some cases, some of my videos, 1.4, 2.2 million people. So suddenly I'm realizing that listening in politics takes on a different power. And the big change in my life is I've gone from thinking that what I had to bring to politics was my ability to think or talk, and realize that what I really can bring is an ability to just stand still and listen.
Will cross some people's mind that that's a device, as it were, a trick, that you stand there and look like you're listening, and maybe you are listening, you're hearing things, but you're not necessarily implementing them, because how can you implement all the different things that are said to you by people? It's a device to give a sense of connection, but it's not actually a new politics, is it?
I think there's something in what you say, and I think it is difficult to implement, but it is remarkable how much politics is missing a sense of individual connection to particular people in particular places. So it's one thing to talk about policy on knife crime, it's another thing to be, as I was, standing in Poplar, where somebody had just been stabbed and had bled to death on the street. It's one thing to talk about the Northern Irish border, it's another thing to be in Derry, Londonderry, and see 3 sides of the border around you and see the the Republican flags still up and see the loyalist flags still up and the peace walls dividing the communities. And there is something, I think, actually quite radical about listening, something quite radical about saying that what's lacking in our democracy is the sense that politicians are actually open to the real problems in a real place, that instead of thinking that politics is about think tanks and policy papers, the politics is often about why is it that in Barking somebody can watch their neighbour have a necklace ripped off her neck? Why is it in Lewisham that there are 7 people in 2 bedrooms? And that really the responsibility of a politician isn't to necessarily come up with grand fancy views on VAT or employers' national insurance, although those are important. A lot of our job is making sure that this street is safe and not filthy, making sure that this community actually has an opportunity to fix its problems. And there's a connection between the listening and the action, because the type of action you need in politics is not just quick and efficient, but it's very particular. So it's about moving from saying I'm on your side to sorting it out.
Well, let's come back to some of that in a second, but I wanted to take you to the near future and the possibility of a Boris Johnson government. How do you see it panning out? We get to September, October, the negotiations presumably, will presume for the purposes of this first sortie, have not gone terribly well. What do you think happens then? Parliament somehow, with you joining in the effort, votes to stop no deal?
Yeah, so I think we know already how it pans out. What Boris has said he'll do is that he'll go to the European Union and get another deal. It's very clear the European Union is not going to grant any new deal. He will then come back to Parliament and he will then attempt, I believe, or at least is what he's promised to do, to try to take us out with no deal by the 31st of October. That will be his first challenge, because he's built a coalition where he's told quite a lot of people are supporting him that he's going for the softest of soft Brexits, and another lot of people are supporting him that he's going to deliver the hardest of hard Brexits. So there will be that first issue for him on how he reconciles the expectations of those people, and indeed the expectations of the public, because if he were to win, he would have won by telling some Conservative Party members what they want to hear, which is that he can take them out of the European Union and it's not going to be damaging, it'll all be fine. And given that I believe that just, I'm afraid, isn't true, he's also going to have some pretty angry party members and a pretty angry public. The next thing that will happen is that Parliament, which is very much against no deal, will work with the Speaker to prevent no deal.
Somehow, some way.
Somehow, some way. But it's not only going to happen in Parliament, it will happen out in the streets. There will be a large public movement against no deal, because the majority of the British public don't want no deal. This is not a patriotic or democratic move. There is no democratic legitimacy for no deal.
Then what?
So then I think he will find that he faces a very difficult choice. Either he tries to push ahead, defying public opinion, potentially defying Parliament, potentially proroguing Parliament to try to drive a no deal through, in which case my belief is that he will face a very, very prolonged period of economic uncertainty, and people will be pretty cross because sheep farmers in my constituency will find they can't export their sheep. Cheese manufacturers will find cheese coming from Ireland at £2,000 a tonne, and they'll have to export £2,700 a tonne. We'll find not just the car industry, but a lot of advanced manufacturing, and anyone who relies on just-in-time supply chains pretty unhappy. And then prices will begin rising in shops. If he puts up, I don't know what he's going to do on tariffs, but you would expect prices to rise. Incomes will come under pressure, household incomes come under pressure. Inflation will go up. There'll be more pressure on government budgets, and it'll be more difficult to fund health and education, or we'll have a ballooning debt. So that's one type of problem. The second type of issue that he might face is that he might, if he decided not to do that, try to go to a general election. If he goes to a general election, again, unfortunately, Nigel Farage is not going to cooperate. Nigel Farage has made it very clear that he sees this as the great opportunity for the Brexit Party to supplant the Conservative Party. And this is something he'll be encouraged in feeling, because that's what similar movements in Italy will be telling him, similar movements in the United States will be telling him, so that we will end up in going into a general election, which I'm afraid in that situation the Conservatives would lose.
That first scenario that you painted, from your perspective, reckless and damaging pursuit of no deal, you would presumably vote to bring down a government like that.
My objective throughout is to try to save the Conservative Party if I can, because I'm also a Conservative and I'm also very concerned about the damage that Jeremy Corbyn would do. So what I would be doing is both outside Parliament and inside Parliament working to prevent that no deal happening.
Can I just explore the work that phrase "if I can" is doing in that sentence? Because it's by no means certain, if we've got to a sort of scenario where there's a Conservative Prime Minister, from your perspective, capable of doing reckless things, damaging things, it's by no means certain that you can, or many other people can, save the Conservative Party, or indeed, from your perspective, that it's worth saving in that scenario, is it?
Well,
it's a failed project.
We have to weigh it up against the other problem, which is the issue of Jeremy Corbyn and
solutions, some people would say.
and what he means. So I would say that the Speaker will work with us hard in October to make sure that we can use every legislative constitutional instrument at our disposal to make sure that the majority will of the British people in Parliament, which is against the no-deal Brexit, not against Brexit, but against the no-deal Brexit, is exercised. And that's where I'm going to start.
This Conservative Party that you love, I don't know if that's too strong a word, you're nodding, I'm just wondering whether it is the Conservative Party that's around us now. You'll have seen opinion polls recently of Conservative Party members who say, according to these polls, that they're ready to sacrifice the union with Scotland. They're ready to sacrifice Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. They're ready to sacrifice the Conservative Party itself for Brexit. Is that a Conservative Party you recognise?
It's not my type of Conservative Party. It's what I've been trying to argue against.
But we're talking about 60% in these polls, and these polls have suggested in the past they've been quite accurate.
I very, very strongly would disagree with that vision of the country, or indeed the party. And I would be fighting very strongly to say that the United Kingdom is everything for me. I mean, I'm a Scot, I represent an English constituency, I literally have no country if the United Kingdom breaks up. I don't think anything for me is worth more than keeping the United Kingdom, and I think that strand of English nationalism is something that I strongly, strongly oppose. I think, for me, the Conservative Party is above all the party of moderation, of pragmatism, of common sense. It's the reason it's the most successful party almost in the world, the longest lived party in the world, is because it's been pragmatic and non-ideological, and that the great appeal of the Conservative Party, if we can retain our common sense, is partly at the moment that people don't want Jeremy Corbyn. They don't want that type, or not many people want that kind of vision of an ideological, polarised politics. And the future of the Conservative Party lies, at the moment, particularly in the centre ground. So I would be arguing very strongly against that trend.
There comes a point when you realise your arguments are falling on stony ground, doesn't there?
There always does, yeah. There always comes that
You
point.
can't rule that out.
No, I can't rule anything out, Gary, but I still believe strongly, on the basis of my association, my constituents, my voters, and indeed the associations that I've talked to in many other parts of the country, that strand of moderation, pragmatism, common sense is still the dominant strand, and that, yes, opinion polls are showing a lot of support for no deal, but it's because I think politicians have misled people. They haven't let people really understand the fact that that really is a recipe for delay, that people are supporting that because they think it's a quick way out. It's not a quick way out. And I think also people were never really given a chance to talk in details through the withdrawal agreement. My farmers were never really explained what the tariff structures meant, or the fact there will be 40 to 60% tariffs on agricultural products. Many of my farmers who are exporting 90% of their sheep to Europe simply don't understand what would happen in a no-deal Brexit. There's a huge amount of information that needs to be conveyed, and I believe in politics because I believe not just in listening, but in trying to convey information.
But people have become very entrenched. You might say they have an information deficit, but those very same people, I imagine you find, are very entrenched in their positions. Quite hard to turn around, quite hard to get them to listen.
Yes, yeah, it is difficult. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a farmer about exactly this. And of course he kept saying, well, it'll be fine.
WTO, he probably said.
Yeah, fine, absolutely fine, no problem. I'm sure we'll be fine, we were fine. I mean, one of the lines one of my colleagues used is she said to me, well, we survived the Black Death. Now, I mean, yes, I mean, some of us survived the Black Death, but that isn't really a good argument for doing something. I mean, I think the point is that it will be risky, it will be damaging, and it's unnecessary. There are many better and more thoughtful ways of leaving the European Union, and in fact, probably quicker ways.
Some people watched your candidacy. There were any number of reactions. I'm not sure Matt Hancock will ever quickly forgive you for stealing his thunder as the young pretender. Has he forgiven you, by the way?
Well, I'm sure he has. He's a very, very cheery chap. As you know, he's now a prominent supporter of Boris Johnson. Yes,
we'll come back to that maybe if we've got time. But some people watched you and thought you were auditioning perhaps for a new role in a centrist formation in politics that isn't quite there yet, that may be there one day when the ice shelves crack in the two main parties. You can't rule that out, can you?
You can't rule anything out, but I'm a conservative. I became a conservative on the ground in Iraq during the Iraq War. And I'm a conservative because I believe, if I can be a little bit theoretical for a moment, because I believe in limited government and in individual rights and respect for tradition and love my country and prudence at home and restraint abroad. I mean, these are principles which make me a conservative.
They're the ones I could hear a Lib Dem reciting in a leadership contest.
Possibly Paddy Ashdown, but then he would also have said other things that I don't agree with. I mean, he was a great friend of mine, and he was always trying to bang on about things I don't agree with, like proportional representation. He was extremely interested in attitudes towards local government reform that I didn't believe in. I mean, yes, of course it's true that there are people on the right wing of the Lib Dems who begin to touch people who are in the centre ground of the Conservative Party. That's true.
You probably had more in common with the late Paddy Ashdown than you do with Boris Johnson, don't you?
Yes, I mean, we certainly had a similar early life.
Politically?
Politically? Well, we have very similar life experiences, but in the end, Paddy and I couldn't agree actually on fundamental constitutional issues.
You know where I'm going, because so many people are scratching their heads and wondering as they watched you, the darling of certain centre-left commentators during that leadership contest. What are you doing in this party?
What I was doing is proving that the people that were enthusiastic in the end about joining the Conservative Party. I mean, what was extraordinary about it is that although people teased me for turning up on the South Bank or Speaker's Corner and getting ultimately 500-600 people coming, those were people, yes, they were younger people, yes, they were people who were not Conservative Party members, but they were all turning up to say that they would vote for the Conservative Party if I was leader. And they represent what is potentially 6, 7, 8 million people out there in the country desperate for an alternative to Jeremy Corbyn, an alternative to Nigel Farage. And what's been so moving for me is that extends all the way to Labour councillors who are coming up to me saying they would vote Conservative. It's a big thing for a Labour councillor to say, and I never concealed the fact I'm a Conservative. In fact, in all these speeches, I'm saying to them, join the Conservative Party. Save the Conservative Party. And the fact that they're willing to come on board with that, I think is a response to my colleagues who think that if you are appealing I mean, if you look at the polls, the thing I was criticised for is that my support was 18 to 45-year-olds, London, Scotland. I'm currently, at the moment, according to YouGov, something like the second most popular politician in Scotland. Now, these are not things to be ashamed of. They're things to celebrate. They're things the Conservative Party, if it's to live and flourish, we need 18 to 45-year-old voters. We need London. We need Scotland. If we say goodbye to those things, we're saying goodbye to the future.
And as you know as well, there was another criticism made during this campaign, which was that an awful lot of these people who were wowed by you on the centre, in the centre of politics, centre-left, didn't read up on your record of supporting austerity measures, for instance, supporting benefits cuts, supporting the whole George Osborne cuts programme, which you did support and presumably still support to this day.
Yes, and I've been quite open about the fact that I'm a Conservative. I'm not trying to pretend to people that I'm Jeremy Corbyn.
But those people you were trying to listen to in the street, an awful lot of them would feel that some of their problems, the neighbourhood issues that were around, their greatest pain and gripes were to do with those austerity measures, whether it was benefit cuts or they inability to get an operation or something wrong with the school because of cuts. All that agenda, they would argue that's what the problem was.
Some of them would, Gary, but many of them also are mistrustful of Jeremy Corbyn. They're mistrustful of his finances, of his economic policy, they're not certain that he's competent or pragmatic. So I think many of those people would be torn. On the one hand, they would say, okay, these people cut too far, too fast. On the other hand, they probably are reassured that I'm not making spending commitments that I can't fund. I'm not promising tax cuts that we can't afford. I mean, one of the interesting things is that my message, which was consistent during the campaign, which was of economic conservatism, in other words, yes, it's true that I wasn't promising tax cuts, but equally I wasn't trying to promise huge spending pledges, was surprisingly popular even with younger people who are looking to some extent for reassurance, a sense that this is a serious country, that we have a serious government, and that yes, also we care, but this is one of the keys. What this campaign brought home to me is a very strong intuition I have that the people that we've really let down are probably the bottom or the poorest tenth of our society, who have been ignored, I feel, to some extent by all political parties because unfortunately they don't vote. Prisoners who aren't allowed to vote, but many of the other people that I saw, I mean the sort of people who are actually getting stabbed in Poplar, or my prisoners that I was dealing with when I was prison minister, where 40% of them have been in care, 60% of them have mental health issues, 50% of them have reading ages under 11. That's where the real scandal, shame in our society is, the poor elderly. But oddly, because those people don't vote, all the other political parties are conspiring to make out that the majority of us are in this sort of terrible state of suffering, which I worry actually detracts attention from the people who are really feeling the brunt of this. So if I were lucky enough to become Prime Minister, that's, I'm afraid, really where my priority is. That's where my sense of moral obligation and energy is addressing those people, those communities.
The picture you paint of a potential Boris Johnson administration makes me think you think the next leadership contest wouldn't be that far off. I mean, it would be chaotic and disastrous as you paint it. So, I mean, you just said, if I were to become Prime Minister, another contest, in your eyes, in your mind, isn't potentially that far off.
We don't know. We don't know. I mean, we would hope that the next Prime Minister would come and have a stable government and stay. You
said you're supporting Jeremy Hunt. How excited are you about the possibility of a Jeremy Hunt premiership?
I would be immensely reassured. Immensely reassured.
Just because it's a lot better than the alternative?
I think that he's a serious competent. I mean, he sits with me on the National Security Council, he sits with me in Cabinet.
He'd want to renegotiate the backstop, he'd take us out with no deal if that didn't work. That sounds familiar. That's someone else's plan as well, isn't it?
So all of that, obviously, I was opposed to. All of that I criticised him for in the leadership debate. So I can't pretend that I agree with Jeremy Hunt 100%, but
his central strategy for Brexit is wrong-headed.
I will sleep much more easily in my bed with Jeremy Hunt as Prime Minister.
It really is the lesser of two evils.
No. I mean, he did more than that. And this is a very sensitive campaign, and I don't want to speak for him, but he has also made it very clear that he thinks no deal is a very, very damaging event, and that he will do an enormous amount to try to avoid it. And he spoke about businesses and the impact on them. He spoke in the debate against Boris Johnson on sheep farmers. He hasn't set this arbitrary deadline in the way that Boris has. And I think actually even that little exchange in my catastrophic BBC debate, where he said to Boris, if you were on the verge of a deal by the 31st of October, what would you say to the sheep farmer that you were about to take up, reveals that actually there is a real difference between these two and their attitude towards no deal.
Presumably, if Jeremy Hunt was in a certain place in the political spectrum, he'd be putting you out as a spokesperson for the campaign, but he's not, is he?
No. I mean, I am very. I have a lot of admiration for him. I really like him, and I've made it very clear that I support him. But we disagree, and I imagine he is quite understandably doesn't want somebody out who disagrees with him on the biggest issue of our day, which is that I have said that I would rule out no deal Brexit. He says that he would keep it in, and he doesn't want to muddy that water, understandably.
And it, being realistic, I mean, he's got a lot of ground to make up. It's not going to happen, is it?
Well, I don't know, because a lot of my constituents, including members of the association, I think will think quite seriously about this. I mean, the question is, who do you want to epitomize your country? The leader of your country, you don't just select on the basis of the promises they make in an election campaign. You select them on the basis of how other countries will view you, how posterity will view you. You know, what is their dignity? What is their seriousness? Is their decision-making capacity? You feel proud of this person. Is this person prime ministerial? And I think if you ask that question, as a lot of the associations will, they probably will feel Jeremy Hunt is more prime ministerial.
Can I ask you a few just final quick questions? If you had been a spy, would you ever tell anyone?
No.
So the denials we shouldn't rest too much authority on.
I mean, there's a more serious point here, Gary, which is that the reason why the identity of intelligence officers is sensitive, and why I'm a bit cross about this issue, is that the Daily Telegraph story has now started an entire social media rumour, which then affects staff working for charities that I've worked with in Afghanistan, who are now being accused of being connected with intelligence operations, which is very dangerous. I mean, there's literally people turning up with suicide bombs on their door. So when I say I'm not an intelligence officer, I mean I'm not an intelligence officer, and I also was trying to say to the Daily Telegraph, for goodness sake, this is an incredibly irresponsible and dangerous accusation. I mean, it was irrelevant in the election campaign. Nobody gives monkeys here in Britain, but there are countries in the world where people I've worked with are then put in enormous amounts of unnecessary danger, and I was astonished. I mean, there's actually active D-notices out, which are standing government instructions to prevent newspapers from revealing that sort of stuff or attempting to reveal that kind of stuff, and I couldn't believe they did that.
Any idea where it might have come from? Who might have
I think
provoked them?
My guess is that one of the other campaigns thought it was a way of undermining me.
Should we take a stab at which one?
No, I don't want to get into that. No, I'm not going to be drawn into that.
Totally unrelated question. Do you think you'll ever trust a word Boris Johnson says?
It's a difficult one. I mean, I'm pretty cross with him at the moment because I don't make much sense to the Brexit strategy. I don't understand what he's doing. I don't know why he hasn't allowed himself to be questioned more closely on it. But I don't actually know him that well. I mean, I worked from the Foreign Office. We would have meetings a couple of times a week to talk through policy issues. I wouldn't claim to be one of these people who says, you know, I've known this guy for 30 years. And so I'm not, and I also sort of am a little reluctant to try to look into my colleagues' souls or judge their characters. I want to try to judge them on how good they are at their job. I'm trying to say that the fundamental problem with him, I mean, I've been extremely critical, and I've been criticised by colleagues for being very critical. And indeed, actually, one of the reasons why I performed so badly in the BBC debate is that everybody had told me off so much for being critical that I probably pulled my punches. But the fundamental problem is that I feel that he is promising two completely incompatible things to two different sets of people who are going to be extremely disappointed. And I don't think it's good enough that he doesn't, or he implied that he somehow thinks that you can get a transition period without a withdrawal agreement, or that he thinks that the Brady Amendment and the Malthouse Compromise are the same thing, or that somehow he is going to go zero tariff on agriculture with Europe, which he told me in the BBC debate, without somehow understanding that means Brazilian and Argentinian beef under WTO rules come in zero tariff too, and that's wiping out our farming industry. So I just don't get it. What I want from him is not a window into his soul. I want a sense that he has read the withdrawal agreement.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much indeed for spending time to talk.
Thank you.